And so first of all, I'd like to thank Andy and members of the Theistic Science Group for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. I noticed that, Andy, you gave me the slot right after lunch. We refer to this as the graveyard slot, where the audience resembles either people asleep or dead. So I understand that my task is to make sure everybody is well rested for your presentation, which is coming up. I consider changing my title to Introduction to Conscious Napping. Goethe really is about a change in consciousness when it comes to science, so we'll see how that goes. I want to start with some disclaimers. First of all, I am not a scientist, either by training or bent of mind. I was an elementary school teacher for 17 years, and I've been teaching here at the college for about as long. And so I'm speaking to you as a science educator at the elementary school level. My primary interest in the relationship between science and the sacred is to explore the worldview of modern science and how it shows up in science education, K-12, which was the focus of my doctoral dissertation. My second disclaimer is that Goethe's science is not a theistic science. But neither is it a materialistic science. Rather, it occupies a space between the two. It's not materialistic, but it is empirical. It's an empirical science that includes spiritual reality. So it's compatible with theistic science and can serve as a bridge from materialistic science education to science education in a religious context. And my third disclaimer is that I'm also not a Goethean scientist, and I can make attempts to practice Goethean observation, and so can everybody. It's something that's accessible to all of us, but I'm not making any claims to being an expert. So now that I've convinced you that I'm totally unqualified to speak to you today, we can proceed with our power nap. PowerPoint. Well, let's back to the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. I want to begin with some leading thoughts now. This first one from William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it really is, infinite. And this one from Secrets of Heaven. Doctrine arose when perception was lost. I call this slide my Stephen Conroy-esque slide. Steve is a wonderful photographer who puts captions to his work, and I like how this slide is showing nature down below, kind of darkened, hard to perceive, and then rising up behind it, catching the light, the doctrine, perhaps, of the new church here. So the ancients had a living perception of nature that is lost to modern consciousness. Nature was once perceived as revelation of the divine. Religion literally means reconnection. So religious doctrine arose as a bridge back to the perception of spiritual reality. Here's an overview of what I'll be addressing today. I'm going to start with referencing Ian Barber's framework. He was a theologian and physicist. His categories of the possible relationships between science and religion are often used to frame discussions about science and religion, say a few words about the modern scientific worldview, and then before getting to Goethe's approach to nature, I want to talk about Swedenborg's influence on him. So, Ian Barber's 4 possible relationships between science and religion. The first category is conflict. And this is the relationship we hear most often in the media, because that's the most sensationalist. Religion is reduced to Christian fundamentalism with a literal interpretation of the first chapters of the book of Exodus. And science is depicted as objective and fact-based, and so we have conflict. The second possible relationship between science and religion is independence. So this is Stephen Jay Gould's NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. Science and religion are different domains. They ask different questions. And so there is no conflict, so there's nothing to worry about. Religion asks about meaning and purpose. Science is about what the universe is made of and how it works. And this is the relationship that is recommended in K-12 science education. That's what the stance you're meant to take. A third possible relationship is dialogue. Well, actually, maybe there are some areas where these two realms overlap. In cosmology, questions about consciousness, questions about the origin of life. There's conversations to be had. And then the fourth possible relationship, integration. And this symposium really is about the last two possible relationships. How do we integrate religion and science? And that's why I want to talk to you about Goethe's science. Okay. So the scientific worldview could be captured perhaps in this image on the cover of the New Philosophy. This was the cover that came out after the first Theistic Science Symposium 6 years ago. It captures the one-sided reductionist nature of the scientific worldview that is communicated in science education, K-12. Organisms are regarded as mechanisms determined by external forces in a struggle for existence and are somewhat weirdly devoid of context. We have this object way of looking at the world. We are separate from nature and we thingify it in a way. Now, I should mention this appears to be shifting in science education in Pennsylvania. Starting this year, public schools are required to implement the new science standards, which elevate environmental literacy and sustainability. So you might have heard of STEELS, stands for science, technology, engineering, environmental literacy, and sustainability. So as such, there is more attention now to interrelationships between organisms and their environment, sustainability. But I would still suggest that the underlying worldview is still a mechanistic one in presenting that system. Okay, so I wanted to give you a sense of the possible effects of the modern scientific worldview in education. How might it affect young people, either consciously or unconsciously? In her autobiography, the Russian painter and poet Margarita Volanshin, who, by the way, was born in the same year that Darwin died, had this to say about the impact of Darwin's ideas on her as a young adult. So Darwin's ideas made their way to Russia and were really quite popular with the intellectual elite. She says that as a young adult, she was maybe age-appropriately struggling with some existential angst. For me, there came a time of earnest confrontation with materialism. I read Darwin and Haeckel and drew conclusions from them that signified something devastating for me. I was brought to despair by their teaching. I said to myself, if this materialistic world picture were to correspond to the truth, then human beings ought not to talk of morality. If the human being is to be regarded as a higher animal, then he is dependent on the struggle for existence. Egoism would then not only be justified, it would be the highest ideal. Human destiny would be a complex of meaningless chance occurrences. If nature was nothing but a dead mechanism, then everything the human being was able to experience of the moods of nature was only subjective feeling and delusion. One ought not to even speak of colors and tones, for in reality they were only vibrations. Landscape, which I experienced so strongly before, became for me the corpse of a once loved friend. It went so far that I could not look up at the starry sky without a shudder at this soulless infinite space in which dead bodies supposedly circled mechanically. What was matter? How did consciousness arise out of material processes? In answer to these questions, natural scientists could only say, we shall never know. If that's how matters stand, I thought, then human life is an unworthy affair, and one is actually obligated to have done with it. Not only did I think this, I felt it to be so. I saw every day as a pointless procedure, a comedy, unworthy of the human being. So is life merely a series of mechanical processes and random occurrences? The heavenly doctrines have something different to say about that. Continued existence is a perpetual coming into being. And it was this perpetual coming into being that Goethe developed a capacity to perceive. Secrets of Heaven 5084. Every single thing is kept in being, even as it was brought into being, through an influx from the spiritual world, that is, from the divine coming through the spiritual world. So again, our leading thought, doctrine arose when perception was lost as a means to return to it. This presentation is going to be a look at how Goethean science approaches nature by cultivating a kind of perception that is different from our ordinary, everyday, onlooker consciousness, which tends to set us apart from and assumes a separation from nature. How do we overcome that? But before we look at that approach, let's look at Swedenborg's influence on Goethe and how well Goethe's approach accords with a Swedenborgian worldview. First of all, who was Goethe? Well, if you Google Goethe, you'll find him described as a German writer and statesman. He wrote novels, poetry, plays, literary and aesthetic criticism. By the time he was 25, he had written a best-selling novel in Germany. His written work on botany, anatomy, and color would also be mentioned if you Googled him, but Goethe is most famous for his literature, sometimes known as Germany's Shakespeare. He was the first of the great romantics, and those, of course, were followed by the transcendentalists. Let's take a look at him in that context. So there he is, contemporary with William Blake and Wordsworth and Emerson, He was born in 1749, and he was also alive during Swedenborg's lifetime. He was 23 when Swedenborg died. Goethe was also contemporary with Charles Darwin. He was 60 years old when Darwin was born, and Goethe being 23 when Swedenborg died, Darwin was 23 when Goethe died. Of course, the most obvious direct influence of Swedenborg on Goethe was his hairstyle. This is clearly shown in these drawings. Here we see Goethe growing concerned about his receding hairline. So, the direct influence of Swedenborg on Goethe came about in the early 1770s, while Goethe spent time in Frankfurt with his mother's good friend, Susanne von Klettenberg, who was an abbess and a writer, kind of a spiritual godmother to Goethe, and she introduced him to Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia. And this introduction brought Goethe to adopt the underlying principles of Swedenborg's Principia and the economy of the animal kingdom. And Goethe's famous play Faust is a wonderful example of how he incorporates the Swedenborgian worldview. His description of the spiritual world draws heavily on Swedenborg's descriptions. In a letter to the Swiss poet Lavater, we have a statement of Goethe's worldview. He said, "I am more inclined than ever to believe in a world outside of this visible one, and I have sufficient power of life and poetry to feel my own limited self broadened into a Swedenborgian spirit universe." Okay, so how does Goethe approach nature? Yeah, so although most famous for his literature, Goethe actually devoted more of his time to scientific investigation than to poetry. And at the end of his life, he attached more importance to this part of himself than he did to his world-famous poetry. He was a very careful observer of nature in many forms. He studied botany, geology, meteorology, anatomy. And one of the hallmarks of his approach to science was staying faithful to the sensory appearance before him, not just the aspects of nature that are measurable, but all of the ways in which nature presents itself to the senses. So his approach to nature was holistic. Holistic in the sense of studying the relationships of forms rather than as isolated entities. So you could call his approach ecological. And there's a lot to be said about what that entails, but for now let's just mark it as his approach is holistic, not reductionist. I'd like to share some quotes from Friedemann Schwarzkopf's book, The Archetypal Phenomena, A Guide for a Goethean Approach to Natural Science. The fundamental difference of Goethe's approach is his attempt to learn to read in the book of nature rather than to analyze its parts. Reading means to treat the sense-perceptual aspects of nature like letters of a word or words of a text as signs for meaning. So recalling for the ancients, nature was a theater representative of the Lord's kingdom. This is what Goethe was attempting to read, and he said in a letter to a friend, "I cannot tell you how readable the book of nature is becoming for me. My long efforts at deciphering letter by letter have helped me. Now, all of a sudden, it is having its effect, and my quiet joy is inexpressible. So the analytic procedure of modern science has a tendency to dissect natural substances in order to explain them. Goethean science attempts to understand rather than explain. As one scientist wrote, Goethean science does not offer an alternative explanation of nature, but rather an alternative to explanation. Goethe suggests that we enter into an understanding, a conversation with nature. Goethe used the term Anschauung to designate the kind of sense perception which is permeated by intuitive perception. It means the simultaneous beholding of the outer form with the physical eye and the idea with the inner eye of the spirit. The eye of the senses sees the outer form, while the spiritual eye understands. So if this mode of beholding, Anschauung, leads us to where the ideal archetype is experienced in its reality, in conscious awareness, we can truly speak of imaginative perception. So Schwarzkopf sees Anschauung, this mode of beholding, as a step towards perceiving the archetype. So is the ideal archetype and Swedenborg's correspondence the same? In his book, The Metamorphosis of Plants, Goethe wrote, "When something has acquired a form, it immediately metamorphoses into a new one. Nature is in a perpetual state of becoming." So to really understand nature, which is in constant flux, our intellect is not equal to the task. It can do other great things, but it can't enter into nature in its becomingness. As the philosopher Henri Bergson said, becoming slips through our fingers. In his essay, The Rediscovery of Meaning, Owen Barfield states, Goethe was convinced that the scientific method that came into vogue during the scientific revolution was not the only possible one. In particular, he held that for dealing with the phenomena of life and growth, it was an inadequate method. For the whole process of becoming is one which eludes the categories of cause and effect. Goethe claimed that nature has an inside which cannot be weighed or measured, that is perceptible, not to the untrained senses, but to a faculty of perception that can be cultivated. So, in addition to measuring quantities, the scientist must train himself to perceive qualities. So, you can train yourself to perceive qualities, says Barfield, says Goethe, only by sinking into the contemplation of the outward form so that the imagination penetrates to the activity which is producing it. As Goethe said, every object well contemplated develops an organ for its perception. Barfield said of ancient people, early man did not observe nature in our detached way. He participated mentally and physically in her inner and outer process. The scientific revolution, hundreds of years ago, was a time when people began to relate to the world around them in an entirely new way, meticulously observing the facts of nature and systematically interpreting them in terms of physical cause and effect. And this habit has been growing ever since, largely to our benefit. He points out that when it comes to investigating nature, this exclusive emphasis on physical causes and effects has taken on the characteristics of a dogma that allows no other approach to studying phenomena. So Barfield posed the question, can science learn to supplement its weighing, measuring, and statistics with the systematic use of imagination? Now, Barfield was not talking about the kind of imagination we usually refer to when we use this word, talking about coming up with creative solutions to things or a kind of fantasy that isn't grounded in reality. When he uses this word imagination, he's talking about a faculty of perception. So can we cultivate this faculty of perception? And how do we do that? By sinking into the contemplative beholding that is before our senses, of whatever it is that's before our senses. By detaching himself more and more from the world of nature, said Barfield, as he has been doing since the scientific revolution, man has gradually developed the quantitative approach, which has given him marvelous powers of control. But in doing so, he has necessarily lost, for the time being, that felt union with the inner origin of outward forms, which constitutes perception of their meaning. So we have the butterfly here as a perennial symbol of the principle of metamorphosis. And observing the principle of metamorphosis at work in the unfolding of a plant or a caterpillar into a butterfly or a tadpole into a frog, we can experience, I think, the inadequacy of the mindset of explaining things in terms of cause and effect. Because there is nothing linear in a predictable way that could tell you that this caterpillar, if you had no prior knowledge, this earthbound, leaf-munching, green, wiggly, worm-like creature was going to become a being that's completely airborne and colorful and light and airy, and off it goes. There isn't a cause and effect that you could point to in a physical way. So how do we come to appreciate this principle of metamorphosis that is so pervasive in the world of nature? Can we immerse ourselves and absorb the realities of metamorphosis? Can we change our way of thinking? That's really what it would take. Goethe said that in order to understand nature, our thinking has to become as flexible and fluid as nature herself. Can we experience metamorphosis in the way we think. There is a delicate empiricism which makes itself utterly identical with the object, thereby becoming true theory. So Goethe is using the word theory here in its original meaning. Theory comes from the Greek word theoria, which originally meant something like a way of seeing or contemplative observation. It had strong philosophical and even spiritual connotations in ancient Greece. So a theory was not just an explanation of phenomena, but an act of attending deeply to the nature of things. He goes on to say, but this enhancement of our mental powers belongs to a highly evolved age. So to develop this capacity in a conscious way that, maybe ancient men used to have is maybe something for the future. Goethe recognized that. All right, so I'm just going to check my time here. Very good. We do have time to try a little bit of an exercise, I think. And Ian's going to help me pass out some sunflower seeds. And maybe Andy, you could too. Could you give everybody a seed? And Steve, could you help? Yeah, just take a sunflower seed. Okay. Is that better? Can people hear me okay? Okay. So, mathematics, as you may know, has been dubbed the language of science. And you heard early in the presentation that Goethe's science is dealing with non-quantitative aspects of nature, looking at the qualities that appear to our senses. Yeah. So there is a mathematics that is compatible with Goethean science, however. So it can't be a quantitative mathematics, but rather a qualitative one in the form of projective geometry, which is a kind of geometry that was made use of by the artists of the Renaissance to accurately depict the appearance of three-dimensional landscapes on two-dimensional canvases. And it's interesting to me that projective geometry is faithful to the sensory appearance. And that was always what Goethe's approach to nature was about, the reality of the sensory appearance. So, for example, parallel lines, when we are looking around at the landscape, appear to converge, even though we know those train tracks aren't going to meet. It looks like they are going to. Well, in projective geometry, which is a non-Euclidean geometry, parallel lines do meet at infinity. So in Euclidean geometry, parallel lines, they never meet, right? That's one of the postulates. in projective geometry, they meet at infinity. So I'd like to do just a little exercise with you to kind of get into that mode. It's a kind of geometry where if you do the exercises, it does cultivate a kind of fluid way of thinking, a flexible way of thinking that then can make plant observation more fruitful. So if you could imagine for a moment a line going to infinity, both directions, and then a point above the line, and then picture another line going through the point so that it intersects the line. Is everybody with me? Okay. And now start to rotate the line through the pivot point, and notice that the point of intersection is moving to your right. Yes? Okay? It's still intersecting that line, but the intersection point is going further and further and further away. It's really far out there now, and then bang! The lines are parallel, and whoa, I keep turning, and the point of intersection is now very, very far that way, and getting closer and closer and closer and closer to me. We keep going. Point of intersection is going, and bang! The point of intersection at this point, when the lines are parallel, is at infinity, and then it pops back in. So you and I cannot picture the point at infinity. That's not possible. But we can experience its necessity in this situation. And by working through projective geometry exercises, you have that experience over and over again, where logic and imagination come together in experiential ways. You can't deny the necessity for the reality of the point at infinity. All right, so if you could now take the sunflower seed and just behold it in your hand, and for a moment take some time to picture the sunflower plant in its enfolding. Were we to bring about the right conditions, some soil, some warmth, some water to allow for the germination, and then the light of the sun, and see if you can take that seed up through a seedling into a plant, and all the way up into a flower, and so on. So I'll give you just some silence to try to recreate that unfolding. Okay. Did you see something like this? question for you now is, if you look at the seed in your hand, where is the sunflower plant right now? Yep.
In the spiritual world.
Is it, right? Is it at infinity? Is it in the spiritual world? This is something we can think about. So Goethe, in his Metamorphosis of Plants, uses the picture of contraction and expansion throughout the metamorphic process. So the contraction of the seed, expansion into leaf, contraction into calyx, expansion into sepal, contraction into pistil stamens, expansion into fruit, contraction, ultimate contraction into seed. This is the most contracted. So what has contracted into the seed is this, for Goethe, this spiritual archetype that is not a static form. For Goethe, form was always a verb. We have to feel that in our thinking. It's not something our intellect can follow very well. We have to find some other faculty in us to enter into that sense of the movement that is the unfolding of that plant. So, lots to contemplate there. So, dedicating attention to natural phenomena is the very thing that transforms one's ability to perceive. I think we all have experienced that the more we know about something, the more time we spend carving wood and creating contours on surfaces, the more sensitized we become to how planes meet one another, and we see the contours of the landscape. Whatever we immerse ourselves in creates an organ of perception. So dedicating attention to individual plant forms, to organisms, develops the capacity to perceive them even more. So Goethe's contribution to bridging the gap between science and the sacred was to suggest that the scientific endeavor is a training of the faculty of perception. He said our own thinking has to become as mobile and fluid as nature herself in order to perceive the realm of life. He understood that dedicating attention to natural phenomena transforms one's ability to perceive. Thus, for Goethe, science was about a transformation of the human being in order to understand the living character of the world. So as we draw to a close here, I'd like to read an excerpt from a paper that Goethean scientist Craig Holdridge gave at the New York Academy of Scientists in 2013. Goethe saw that progress in science depends upon the development of inner capacities and sensibilities. In a radical way, Goethe expanded the notion of scientific understanding, which becomes especially clear in his biological work. He articulated biological understanding as the direct beholding, Anschauung, of what constitutes the living wholeness of the organism. It's a form of knowing that allowed or compelled him to speak of an archetype that informs the life of the organism. Volumes have been written about this central feature of Goethe's science, volumes of deep misunderstanding and of deep understanding and clarification. What's been done much less is to practice this way of knowing, since only through practice do its real challenges and its real promise become experience. Through practice, the seed that Goethe sowed can grow and contribute to a more truthful understanding of nature. So it's interesting to me to see the parallels between Swedenborg's concept of correspondences and Goethe's concept of the ideal archetype. So correspondences are not merely symbols or representations, they are the active, living realities that perpetuate existence. How do we cleanse the doors of perception so that we might witness the spiritual reality sustaining the natural world? Perhaps by paying attention. According to Goethe, bringing together sense perception and the idea through receptive observation of phenomena is what could make this possible. So science as transformation of consciousness such that it becomes capable of perceiving the living spiritual reality of natural phenomena, that would be an integration of science and religion. And I'm going to close, I have 1 minute left, with 4 lines of poetry from Goethe. And when you hear this word, which is hyphenated, God in nature, you can picture the burning bush. What higher goal can any man attain than seeing God in nature as it is revealed? How forms once fixed to spirit she lets flow, how spirits firmly held in forms below. Thank you.